So with us is Tomasz. I'll let you introduce yourself. But before I do want to share something as a fanboy. I've been a big fan of Tomasz's blog. I've been reading it for like, I think at least 5 to 7 years now. One of the best uh, resources anywhere on the internet is tomtungus.com. Highly recommend. If you haven't read it, go read it. One of my favorite posts that he wrote that I was reading this morning was how much more efficient should a SaaS startup be when using AI? We'll talk about that, but why don't we start off with your introduction first?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Tom Tunguz. I am a venture capitalist. I founded a firm called Theory. We raised about $235 million to invest in early-stage software and infrastructure companies across 3 key areas. One is applied machine learning, which is why we're here. The second is data infrastructure, and then the last is blockchains as databases. And before this, I was at Redpoint for about 14 and a half years, had the privilege of working with 8 unicorns, and worked at Google from '05 to '08 on the AdSense team.
That's amazing. Before we start to break down, like, why should startups care about AI, or how should they think about AI? What AI tools you have been using to make yourself more productive?
Well, I use Copilot for coding, and I use a terminal-based email client, and so it actually auto-completes email in there, which is pretty good. I've used a couple of content generation. So actually, the deck that I prepared on AI initially was machine generated and then modified. All the images are Mid-Journey. All the blog posts images, the header, the hero images are machine generated. So I try to use quite a few. I use dictation a lot on the computer for blog posts and emails. I actually dictated a book.
Wow.
So I really love AI.
Tom, our first question to you is, like, why does AI matter? I think, and then help us frame the opportunity.
Yeah, so I think AI is going to be a really big deal. And to put it into perspective, one of the questions that I asked was, each technology innovation has some impact to US GDP or global GDP. What is the relative impact of AI to US GDP compared to the personal computer? And the answer, so Goldman released a study, the answer is something like 1 to 5,000 times more impact to GDP. So Goldman's initial report said that the impact to US GDP from AI would be about 2.9% in the medium case, 7% on the upside case. Oh, that's much better. Yeah. Goldman's initial report said that the impact to US GDP would be about 2.9% in the medium case, 7% on the upside case. And that's net of the job losses associated with AI. I mean, to put that in perspective, the US GDP grows somewhere between 2 to 2.5% per year for the last 20 years. So you'd be doubling US GDP, which is a pretty big deal. And that's in the base case for what Goldman says. So that's why the opportunity is so big. That's why so many people are excited.
And what are some of the core drivers there?
Well, so UPenn and Goldman researched what fraction of different kinds of jobs could be automated. And on average, you're looking at something like 25 to 50% of most people's, particularly white-collar tasks would be automated. And there's a great fear that kind of comes from that, which is destabilization of the societal structure. But the reality is, like, small deal. But the reality is, like, in like 1918, there were 1.5 million people employed washing dishes, and then somebody invented a mechanical dishwasher, and we kept going. And people kept eating at restaurants, and people were happier, and I think the same story will happen here. So, so this is why it's such a big deal at a high level.
You created this beautiful framework about how should startups think about AI. Like, what are those? What is that framework? If you can share that, and then potentially we can go deep into each of them as we navigate our chat.
Yeah, you bet. So I think there are a couple of different things. The first question, if you're a startup thinking about AI, is what market am I going to pursue? The second question, you have the list in front of you, so I've forgotten. But
it's the first is the layer, then the market, then the moat, then the AI depth.
Great. Okay, so let's talk about the layer. So in software, there's 3 different layers. There's the application layer, there's the platform layer, and then there's the infrastructure layer. And if we go in reverse order, infrastructure. Okay, so if we look at, if you take a look at the top publicly traded companies and you aggregate the market cap, you take a look at the infrastructure players. You've got Amazon, AWS, you have Google's GCP, and you have Microsoft Azure. And you calculate the market cap, it's about 2.1 trillion. That's what those three businesses are worth in the public markets if they were to trade as independent entities. And then you take the top 100 publicly traded B2C and B2B cloud companies, Netflix, ServiceNow, Snowflake, blah, blah, blah. They're worth about the same, 2.1 trillion. The major difference is there are 3 infrastructure players and there are 100 application players. So if the AI space plays out the same, and it really should, just given the economies of scale that infrastructure companies benefit from, then if you're a startup, you're probably much better off playing at the application layer than you are at the infrastructure layer, unless you can raise 500 million or several $billion in order to build an infrastructure company. And some people can do that. So at a high level, I think about like the application tier and the platform tier as being two of the more interesting opportunities to go after. The platform tier is really about, Julia and the other guest whose name escapes me now, what was his name? John, talked a lot about how you really shouldn't hire an AI engineer out of the gate. And I think what we're seeing with AI is what I've called this Twilio moment. It used to be really difficult to send an SMS with code. It used to be really difficult to accept money with code before Stripe. And with AI now, with literally like 5 lines of code, you can create a chatbot on top of some unstructured piece of content. And so that's sort of where we are. The big theme within the platform layer is enterprise readiness. So if you talk to any major company like a Wells Fargo or a JLL, the thing that they're worried about is this is really cool technology, but how do we bring it into our enterprise in a way that's safe, that's compliant, and doesn't lose us intellectual property or trade secrets? So at the platform layer, that's a place where
That's amazing.
particularly interested.
One statement that like really stood out to me as I was reading the material that you published is for the market category, which is the second theme. You say that startups have negative time to launch. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so in most ways, if you think about like the internet or you think about blockchain or mobile apps, startups were the first ones to deploy the first website, the first mobile app, the first blockchain. In AI, startups are last. So Microsoft has a business that has gone from 0 to 900 million in ARR in 2 quarters on AI. In the last earnings announcement, the company that Microsoft decided to highlight as being innovative in deploying AI was Epic, Cerner, which is the slowest moving software. I'm sorry to everybody who works there, but it is like the slowest moving software company and obviously a highly regulated category. And if they can deploy AI within the first, say, 3 months of general availability of the API, that's, that sort of undercuts the advantage for a startup, which means most startups are actually behind. Salesforce has launched an LLM. Databricks has launched an LLM. Every major company is looking to launch an LLM. And meanwhile, the startups, for the first time in a long time, are racing to catch up. And that's what I mean by negative time to launch.
Got it. So how should startup think about finding that white space and operating within that?
So there was this question, can you raise capital if you are Salesforce plus LLM or ServiceNow plus LLM? I think the answer is no. And so we talked about this a little bit last time, but like I had this Belgian marketing professor in grad school, and he wrote this equation on the board, which was innovation equals invention plus distribution. So in order to change the world, you got to create something cool, and then you have to convince people to buy it. Without either one of those 2 ingredients, you don't really change the world. The cost of innovation has gone way down as a result of these models, and so the benefit and the value of distribution goes up. And so with all these AI features, because the 80% version is so easy to release, the thing that is going to differentiate and change the world is not so much the invention anymore, it's the distribution strategy. And the question that I keep racking my brain about is how can a startup use AI as a way of gaining a competitive advantage for finding new customers or selling their product in a different way?
So as startups are beginning to adopt AI, there's of course like, how many of you are building a generative AI or an AI company here? Like half the room, yeah, which is quite amazing. They have to build their moat somewhere. Whether it's on competing on model or accuracy, cost, usage, or enterprise readiness or something else. How should they approach these things?
So there are a couple of different ways of thinking about it. The first is access to a proprietary data set. I think that's an easy knee-jerk one to respond to say. Very few people will have access to proprietary data set. There'll be a handful of different companies. It's really tough. It's really tough to get there. So it's possible, but rare. The second major advantage is really around like reimagining a product, right? So project management, how would you, somebody had talked about this a bit before, but if you remember, like the first mobile applications were basically web apps I-framed into a native app. We've got to rethink the applications in really novel ways. So there's a potential of creating and reimagining products in a completely new way. But I think like ultimately, like you've either got distribution, you find a new way of selling the product that nobody else can compete with, at least for a short period of time, and the other is just execution, which if you look at classic software, there's no differentiation between, there's no sustainable competitive advantage between Slack and the next chat business. There isn't. It's a web app on top of a database. All of SaaS looks like that. Literally every single publicly traded software company is a web app on top of a database. Now you're just adding an LLM to it. So there's no sort of technology advantage unless you're in the business of getting that machine learning model from an 80% accuracy to a 95 to a 97% accuracy in a market where that marginal 15% of accuracy translates to tens or millions or tens of millions of dollars of cost savings for your customer.
Tomasz, what are the verticals or areas that you are personally excited about and have a thesis on that these are some of the areas that I'm going to go chase founders and invest in them?
Yeah, great question. So one big theme is enterprise readiness. We talked a little bit about this. If you're a chief information security officer at every major company, this is now suddenly on your radar and you need to control it. The second major category, I think one of the biggest innovations of these generative models is they extract value from, so in an enterprise, there are two different kinds of data. There's structured data, which is what exists in Snowflake or in Excel, and then there's unstructured data. And so that's like log files or videos or all kinds of documents. And there have been lots of really big businesses that have been built on structured data. It's been almost impossible to build a big business on unstructured data. And what generative AI allows you to do is to take call transcripts, videos, learnings from different user interview sessions. I was talking to the two Jans today before they're building a business there. I think that's really where there's a pretty significant opportunity. And like knowledge management broadly, there's quite a big opportunity there. Those are the two big categories where we're spending time.
Can you talk about a company that you recently invested in that is solving these problems and in which areas?
Not yet.
Okay. I was trying to get it out. Another mode that you talk about is AI depth. How is your AI plugin or tuning something? Is it you doing prompt engineering or is that a bespoke model? How are these things different and where should startups like focus on them? Are these four areas distinct enough where I can latch onto one trend that, hey, I'm going to build a bespoke model and go all in?
Yeah, so there's the plugins are really interesting because they allow you. So I think one of OpenAI's strategies is to go after Google and unbundle search.
Yeah.
Just the way that Craigslist was unbundled and led to. And the plugin architecture is that. Expedia plugs in, all of a sudden you can ask ChatGPT to help you organize a trip and then book it. ChatGPT will have its own distribution. If you're a startup, if you're looking for a distribution angle, this might be one. That's a really interesting way of going about it. The next is you can take a model that's off the shelf or an API, and you can take a bunch of data and you can put it into a database and send it along and tune the model. And there are a bunch of different techniques there, and that will help you improve the accuracy. I think a lot of people are doing this. The third level of model depth is building your own LLM. And I'm starting to see more and more companies do this where they'll take a generative model and then they'll combine it with a classical model. So it could be like, again, like an adversarial network in order to train a particular way. If they're building a new search engine, they might take an extractive model coupled to a generative model. And so you're going to end up with these suites of different kinds of models on a particular use case. The deeper you go, the more technical talent that you need, and likely the more money you need to have raised in order to finance the training, the data acquisition, the labeling, all those kinds of things.
Got it. Daniel is here. Daniel, you asked a very good question. If you don't mind, just me asking the question with Tomasz. How are your views of SaaS GTM changed in the last 12 months, considering the economic downturn, proliferation of AI-enhanced tools that are coming, particularly in SaaS? How are your views changing? You publish a lot on SaaS.
Yeah. Yeah. So to kind of put this in the context, the cost of customer acquisition for the average publicly traded company has gone from about 20K to about 50K in the last 10 years. So it's harder and harder to build a software company. You need to raise more and more dollars in order to get to the same level of ARR. Every once in a while, you have a disruptive distribution strategy. PLG was one, mobile was another, open source is a third. AI hasn't changed that distribution. Right? It's kind of a theme for me. It hasn't changed that distribution, and so I don't think AI has really changed very much for software companies. What has really changed is the broader macro environment where we've gone from best of breed to best of budget. And what I mean by that is the CFO and the procurement team are much more involved in the decisions associated with buying software than they've ever been in the past. And so suites, companies like Rippling or Microsoft are the ones who are actually benefiting in terms of market share relative to point solutions.
I want to also ask another question that got submitted by Saf Faruqi. Compute cost for AI doesn't seem to be part of the conversations currently, but it can be a huge blocker to profitability for startups coming up in this hype cycle. What's your take on that?
Well, for a lot of AI companies, it won't matter because the multiples that VCs are paying for AI companies are so big that the balance sheets make it irrelevant. You know, I was talking to a VPN the other day, and the way that, so it depends on which layer you are. If you're using an API, then you're basically riding OpenAI's cost curve. They'll buy more GPUs than anybody else. They'll get a huge bulk discount from NVIDIA. They'll cut prices in order to win share. And you can make that long-term bet and have a lot of confidence. If, on the other hand, you're training your own model, you do need a significant amount of capital. The training costs are significant, but what a lot of people don't talk about are the inference costs. So you train a model, you get it to work, and then every time a user hits it, you pay some significant fee in order to infer the answer. I don't know what the ratio of costs will be. It's going to depend on your level of scale, but I would imagine for a business at scale, the inference costs are probably like 75 to 90% of the ultimate cost. Yeah. And so there you're going to need significant amount of dollars. On the previous generation of software companies that used AI, so let me put this into perspective. The average publicly traded software company's gross margin is about 71 to 72%. Most of the AI companies that I've looked at that are startups, at the early days are operating somewhere between 40 to 50% gross margin, and they try to get up to that 70% number, and that's because of training. The engineering costs are significantly larger. So I would expect most AI companies that are heavy AI companies to have something like 5 to 15 percentage points less of gross margin than an equivalent non-AI software company.
You talked a little bit about enterprise readiness. You have to, as a startup, you have to build a lot of tooling and compliance and regulations and whatnot. But on the other side, there are enterprises that also need to be ready to adopt AI. Are there any verticals within this enterprise market that you think are more ready for adoption if startups are building and catering AI products to them?
I think everybody's really excited about it. I think the confluence of the global macro plus the cost savings that can accrue to these businesses is significant. I mean, so in 2004, I was working for a startup and we were selling software to automate customer support centers, and we pitched American Express, and American Express was running a $4 billion call center at the time. And we were going to save them like 3 to 4%, and we ended up losing that deal, but the company that won it closed a $51 million ARR contract. So the big businesses where they have huge call centers where they can get a 5 to a 10 percentage point reduction in cost, they're all over I mean, you think about like every major B2C brand, the major banks, the telcos, the carrier, everyone is really excited about this. The major issue is, when we talked about it, it's just compliance. I've got a lot of sensitive data, and the dynamic here with a lot of startups is there's this data that I need to access. I want to train a model or tune it for a particular use case. How do I get access to it in a way that's compliant? And what does that deployment model look like? That's still an unsolved question.
My last question to you before we open it up for the question from our guests, everyone here, is what do you look for when you're investing in AI startup founders? Are there certain traits in these founders that are a little bit different from, say, investing in SaaS or elsewhere?
I don't think so. And so I reframe the question as like, after Twilio came out, what are you looking for in startups that's different now that Twilio is out or Stripe is out? The answer is the same. Mm-hmm. And our answer is, what we're looking for is a technology innovation that leads to go-to-market advantage. So something changes in the technology and all of a sudden you can sell it in a different way. The other thing that we're really looking for are founders who can sell really effectively. I think that's an undervalued attribute of founders. A founder is selling it literally every conversation: fundraising, press, recruitment, customer prospects. So that's really critical. And then the last is a different take on a market, like a slightly different view, an insight that's going to give them a 6 to 12-month advantage to innovate in the market, create the brand for the business, and then spin a flywheel in order to grow it fast.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you, Thomas.